This video will explain GitLab CICD pipelines and how you can use them in your project. So before you can use GitLab CICD pipelines, you have to understand the model. You have to understand everything that's going on here. So one GitLab repository has one and only one pipeline. And a pipeline is created from one YAML file that's located at the root of your repository. And pipelines can send notifications to other pipelines in GitLab. You can also view and replay previous instances of the pipeline, which I'll show later on. And a pipeline contains one-to-many stages. And a stage in a pipeline is a logical grouping of work. So you can think of a stage as being we're going to build some artifacts. Build is a stage, and then we're going to test something. So test is a stage, and deploy something, and deploy is a stage. So one pipeline can have one-to-many stages, and stages are executed sequentially in series. So stage one executes first, then when stage one is done, stage two starts, and when stage two is done, stage three starts, and so on. So one stage can contain one-to-many jobs. So if one stage has two jobs, those two jobs will run in parallel. And when both of those jobs are finished, thus that stage is finished and the next stage starts. And a job is basically something to do. So a job can be something as simple as running unit tests. It could be building something or deploying something or creating some documentation or whatever you want it to do. So a job is pretty much anything you want to do. And the last thing, there's this notion of a GitLab Runner. So a GitLab Runner is basically a process that executes the jobs specified in the YAML file for your GitLab pipeline. And there are two types of runners in GitLab. There are shared runners and there are not shared runners. So a shared runner, if you don't want to spin up a server and run a runner by yourself, you can use the shared runners that GitLab provides. So these are shared computers that are shared among the GitLab community. The problem with that is sometimes they can be a little bit slow, and you have to wait until a runner gets freed up to execute your build job. And if you're really concerned about security, that might be a little bit of a security risk where you're building these things and you're importing private keys and you're creating your builds. So if you're really concerned about security and performance is a big thing, then I suggest you just run a runner yourself. It's really easy to run a GitLab runner. So in this example that I'm going to show, I'm running a GitLab runner on my computer. It runs fast and it works fine, and it's secure. It's building on my computer. So this is what a GitLab pipeline looks like. So this pipeline has 4 stages. There's a build stage, a test, and a deploy, and a docs stage. So you'll see the deploy stage has 2 jobs. In this case, we're deploying an API to production, and we're deploying some cron jobs in production. So these 2 things are usually separate sorts of components. So these 2 things will be deployed separately, independently of each other. And when both of those jobs pass, we go on to the documentation stage here, where we deploy our documents. And this bottom window here, you'll see previous instantiations of a pipeline. You'll see this pipeline was created 14 minutes ago, and we have 4 stages here that correspond to build, test, deploy, and docs. And this one, this pipeline was triggered off of the master branch, and this pipeline was triggered off of the staging branch. And you'll see in this instance we failed the documentation phase because something wasn't configured correctly in my YAML file that caused this to fail. So when stuff fails, you can click on these things and you can get a nice clear error report of where the problem is. So you'll see, I'm going to go through a working demo so you'll see all of this stuff in action. So these are previous instantiations of a pipeline, and if it's configured, you can simply replay these pipelines again. So if you wanted to deploy this again, you can hit a button and it'll go again. So this is the development flow that I like to use. So in this example, there are 3 branches. There's the dev branch, the stage branch, and a master branch. So the idea is the GitLab pipelines are associated with the staging branches, the stage branch, and the master branch. And the dev branch is not associated with the GitLab CICD process. So that's just a regular branch that just sits on its own in the repository. So the typical workflow that I like to follow is that developers branch off of the dev branch, and they will name a branch called dev dash their initials and then provide some sort of context. So this name indicates that I branched off of dev. These are my initials, and I'm fixing the login. So I'm going to branch off of dev, I'm going to do some work, and then I'm going to submit a merge request into GitLab so that the team can review it. So once it gets reviewed, and after some time goes by, maybe after towards the end of a sprint or whenever it feels right, the dev branch will get pushed into the stage branch. And at that time, a GitLab Runner will get triggered off of that event. Once that merge happens, the GitLab Runner picks that up and starts to build this pipeline, starts to instantiate and execute everything in this pipeline. So the GitLab Runner will do a build stage, we'll do a test stage, we'll deploy these 2 things in parallel, and when we're done, we create some documentation, and we ship it off. And then, so we go through there. And then when it feels right again in the project, when we want to move the stuff, when everything in staging is working correctly and we want to push that to production, we do another merge in GitLab. We'll do a merge request from staging to master, and a GitLab Runner will pick up that change and will build this pipeline. And you can see this is a production pipeline with production jobs, production test, production. So we do our build, we test, deploy, and the same thing. So, and that's how that works. So this is what's happening. These are all of the pieces that I'm going to show in this demo. So here we are. We have GitLab. We have stuff running in Amazon, and we have my computer, and we have a GitLab running on my computer. So what I'm going to demonstrate is we're going to write some code. We're going to push code. We're going to merge to stage. The GitLab Runner sees that change. We'll pull the YAML file, build the YAML file, do everything in the YAML file. We'll SSH into the EC2 servers that I have configured in AWS. The servers will pull the latest code from staging. The servers get the latest configuration files from the S3 bucket, and then the last stage we push documentation to S3, and then for merging in production, we just sort of do this cycle again. In GitLab, we merge staging to production, and then the whole cycle repeats again. So let's do a quick demo. So here we are. Here is the AWS Console. So I have 2 servers in AWS. These servers, So these servers are running an Express API. I have one for staging and one for production. And so there are 3 key things here that you want to be aware of. So each server has an elastic IP associated with it. So here is the elastic IP associated with this server, and here's the elastic IP associated with that server. So what that means is when these servers reboot, they will always have the same IP associated with them. This IP will never change. The other thing is to be aware of that these servers need to pull configuration files from S3. So they belong to a role called S3 Admin Access role. So this role enables them to pull, these servers to pull configuration files from S3 without putting any keys on those servers. So that's kind of neat. And the other thing to be aware of is the security groups for these servers. So the security group for these servers, they're running on port 22, and it's port 22 is only open to my IP, and port 5150 is open to my IP. So this is the port that the Express API is running on. So this allows me, and only me, to hit that API and test it and make sure it's working. And this allows my box for me to SSH, and also allows the GitLab Runner, which is running on my box, to do its thing, to connect to the server. And here is the S3 bucket that is storing configuration files for each environment. So I have a configuration file for prod and a configuration file for stage. So these two files, putting these files in an S3 bucket, keeps the files out of the GitLab repository. So best practices says that you shouldn't check in that sort of stuff. So you can put all your secret keys, usernames, passwords, credentials, whatever, you can store them securely in another location outside of the code repository, and you can have the GitLab pipeline essentially pick these files up and deploy them correctly in the right environment. And here's an S3 bucket that we use for our documentation for our API docs. And currently this is what our API documentation looks like right now. So we only have one simple endpoint, get user, and for our API. And so speaking of API, so here is what the API looks like right now. We have a local environment, a staging environment, and a production environment. And our health check is working, our user is working, and in this example we're going to build a truck endpoint. And the truck endpoint returns a 404 because it's not done yet. It's not done in local, hasn't been pushed to staging, and it hasn't been pushed to production. So this is the state of the API in 3 different environments. Our health check is working, our user is working, our truck is a big fat to-do. So health, user, truck. So let's go to the code. So here is what our API looks like. It's a very simple Express API for this example. So I branched off of the dev branch. You can see I built the name of my branch is dev-mb-add truck endpoint. So I already did that. I already added the endpoint, and I already added just a little bit of functionality to it and some documentation. So all the code is done. We're ready. We want to submit this to GitLab. So let's do that. So we're going to execute this and we push it to GitLab. So let's go to GitLab and see what our repository looks like. So here we are. We have our dev, stage, and master. And here's the branch that I just pushed. So we can look at the code there if we wanted to, but let's submit a merge request. We want the team to review this code. So I want to select my source branch, and I'm going to merge this into dev. So we merge this into dev, and that's fine. We can write a description if we want, but I don't want to do that. And we can review our changes, and I added that, and I added that. So we submit the merge request. It goes off to the team. Everybody reviews it. Everybody gives it a thumbs up, and we merge it. So let's go and view our pipelines. So if we refresh our pipeline page in GitLab, we'll see there's no activity. The dev branch is not being used to trigger the pipelines at all. So that goes on. Okay, so it's the end of the sprint. We want to merge the dev branch to staging. So let's do that. So let's merge dev. So let's do a new merge request. We're going to merge the dev branch into the staging branch, and I'm just gonna do this. Oops. And so we can review our changes, and there's our truck endpoint. So let's merge that into staging, and when we do that, we'll see this little indication here. So already the GitLab Runner on my box has detected that change and is building it. So let's go to pipelines and just see it here in the pipeline view. So here we are, we're running. So we did the build phase, so we're running our unit tests right now. So I'm not going to speed up the video, this is real time. I want you to see what this is like. So our unit test pass, we're using Mocha as a unit test framework. So now this is the deploy stage. So this is deploying the API, and if we had some cron jobs, if we had code for cron jobs, it would be deploying the cron jobs as well. So our deploy phase is done, and so our document phase, our document stage is running, and that is complete. So if we go to our documents and if we refresh this page, we should see our new endpoint. So there is our truck endpoint. So if we go and so let's see, so that was the staging branch, which means the staging environment. So now if we go and hit this endpoint, it should work. And if we try to hit this endpoint in production, we should get a 404. So we want to move staging into production. So what we do is we create another merge request. So let's go into here. We create a new merge request. We'll do staging into master. We'll do another, submit the merge request, and we merge it. Let's see if we can go here, refresh, and there we go. So the runner on my computer is picking that up, and we basically do the same thing. We have our build stage that's running. Tests. And then our documentation phase again. And so now if we go to our REST client, and if we hit this endpoint, we should get a 200. And so let's go into here. So in this case, if we wanted to see what failed from a previous pipeline execution, we can just click on this, and we can see where in the pipeline it failed. We click on this, and we get some information. So this is the output of the terminal, and you can see that I misspelled something here. So the errors are actually really pretty nice. You can see what failed. And if we go to the pipelines, and if we go back to this view, we'll click on the last view, and we can see, so let's see, we can click on this, and we can see the example. So here is the output of our unit test. So there's only one unit test, and the business logic is really simple. Should calculate the meaning of life. So there's some business logic that just says what's the meaning of life, and it returns 42, and the unit test checks if it's 42. So if this fails, if this unit test fails, if one test fails, nothing else will get executed. It stops. This deployment does not go through. So if one test fails, this will turn red, and none of the stuff gets executed, and you get a nice email that tells you, hey, this job didn't get built. There's a failure, and then it's very clear as to what the error is. And so let's see, and that is essentially it. So the tricky part is, so let's see how, so basically this all works. This YAML file, this one YAML file has to be placed at the root directory. And so this is essentially this is your pipeline, and these are the stages of this pipeline. So the first stage is build, we test, we deploy, then we do docs. And these stages are executed in this order from top down. and this uses Docker containers under the hood. So each job in this stage creates its own little Docker container. I'm using a node container. So you can see this job, this is the name of a job, is only triggered from the staging branch. That's what this stage means. And here's our little npm script. We're going to do an npm run build, and this is our testing stage. So we just execute npm test, and that starts our Mocha testing. Here is our deploying to the Express API. So we're creating an SSH key, and then we run a script, a bash script for staging that gets the code, checks the code for the staging branch, and gets the configuration file. We might as well look at that. So here is the bash script. So we stop. The Express API is using the forever service to run in the background, and so we stop the forever service. We get the latest code. We get the configuration file from S3, and then we start the API again. So there's the magic there. So if we had multiple API servers, this just iterates over all of the API servers hosting Express. And if we had code for a cron job, this is where the cron job stuff would be. And here is the job for documenting. So we build our docs, and then we simply upload them to S3. And it's the same sort of thing for production. So the top of this is staging, and then the rest is production. And that's really it. The tricky part is understanding this, understanding the entities, or the model, the GitLab CICD pipeline model. Tricky part is understanding all this stuff, understanding the relationships, understanding what these things do. And then once you understand that, then you have to understand how it applies to this YAML file. And there's some pretty good documentation on the GitLab site. There's, just basically read this, and it explains pretty much everything in the YAML file. So that's it.